Well, CITES is a very important time where essentially the big major decisions regarding the commercial use of wild animals are deliberated and decided upon by countries all gathering in one place. So at this particular meeting, there are some discussions about this being a real kind of referendum on the use of exotic pets. There's over 20 species ranging from tortoises to lizards to ornamental spiders to mammal species such as otters, and for a lot of these species they're really talking about whether they can be uplisted to either Appendix 2 or even Appendix 1, which is the highest level of protection possible. An Appendix 1 listing for a species such as the Indian star tortoise would effectively mean that commercial trade and use as an exotic pet would be ended and prohibited. So we're really kind of watching with bated breath to see of these 20 plus species, what's the decision, and are we getting to a point where where we're facing such huge biodiversity loss, and of course with the cruelty and the suffering and the animal welfare implications of using animals as a luxury item. Is it really a point where the world and countries are starting to think that that kind of use is no longer acceptable? So with otters, the real problem is more that they're being incorporated not even to facilities that are openly stating that they're sanctuaries or stating that they're zoos. They're being incorporated into facilities that are openly stating that they're cafes. That they're come and have a coffee and have a social afternoon, and while you're there, have a play around with this really cute cuddly animal. And the danger with otters more is that they are sold and marketed as being a domesticated. There's no difference between an otter and a dog. Look, and there's several things that are at play here, which is really worrying. First of all, it's the actual the alien nature of the cafe itself. These are semi-aquatic mammals. They live in large social groups. They have, they're very intelligent, very lively. The constricted behaviour and the boredom and the frustration that comes in associated with the lack of full stimulation, let alone the lack of just exercise and access to water that they would have. But then you've got in my opinion, even more sinister aspect of how those animals were sourced in the first place. A lot of these animals are sourced directly from the wild, so you are really exacerbating kind of conservation and biodiversity issues, but also from a welfare perspective, those juveniles in many cases have been able to be sourced because the mother otter has been killed. How those animals were stuffed into sacks and the rest of it and kind of transported is a real concern. So in the specific case of otters, it's for me the worrying thing is that you're starting to see them on the high street next to the fashion store, and you walk into the coffee shop and you're seeing a wild animal touted as a photo prop. So when it comes to reintroduction programs, there's a whole raft of criteria and decision making that needs to go into place. First of all, it's the animal itself, whether it's been whether it's become so familiar around people that to release it into the wild, it would be a hazard to itself. It would go up to communities and put itself at risk of conflict events and being killed just for competing with fish, for example, or whether or not it's just close enough to human communities that it's just targeted and poached for trade. Another issue with putting an animal back into the wild is you really need to make sure that the quarantine procedures are in place and it's not going to reintroduce or introduce diseases into the wild population that wouldn't already be there. And then another example is the genetic side of things. You need to make sure that animal isn't bringing an unnatural gene flow and affecting, again, negatively the wild population. So there's all these kind of criteria that are in place that really need to be there. And it's really important to be aware of greenwashing and to really question any animal that's held in captivity. In some situations, it's vital and necessary. On welfare grounds, for example, a dancing bear that's been taken from as a cub from the wild. It's had its nose pierced with a hot iron rod. It's been trained using, you know, really, really stressful aversive conditioning. You know, you basically break the spirit of the animal. You know, that animal just can't go back into the wild. So there needs to be a captive sanctuary-esque setting. I think what's really starting to become clear is the interdependency or the way and the synergy that not just biodiversity and conservation loss, but climate change. You know, climate change and the way that we are heading towards you know, real scary, troubling situation in terms of the climate, the impact that that's having on biodiversity loss, but also the impact that's that's happening to individual wild animals. Not only could we be at a position where we're losing 16% of all species on Earth unless we do, make real changes. There's going to be a real tortuous road that those species, the silent suffering. It's not going to be a happy, humane end when we lose these species. In many cases, it's going to be a real hard road of suffering for millions of individual wild animals. So, of course, there's huge debates on the solutions and how, for biodiversity loss, whether or not captive breeding and wildlife farming can be used as almost like a silver bullet to help prevent the unsustainable wild sourcing or capture from the wild. And unfortunately, increasingly as data has been collected, we are coming across the situation where, there's very few situations, if any, where captive breeding is really the answer. The animal has to be a direct replacement. The captive bred animal has to be that direct replacement for the wild sourced animal. There has to be a no commercial incentive for illegal actors to still try and circumvent it. There has to be such stringent and effective measurements in place to stop the laundering of animals coming through. And I think what's also happening, almost an awakening to that. Even if you could get all of those parts in play, even if you are in a situation where captive breeding of animals is a direct replacement for wild sourced, what are the implications for that individual animal in that facility, in an intensive commercial captive breeding facility? The impact on the animal's well-being, its mental well-being, its physical well-being, I think is starting to be understood, and I think they're starting to be incorporated into discussions, and we're really hoping that will also start turning into policy, and ultimately decisions will be made not just on the conservation basis, but also on the animal welfare implications as well. What we're really hoping is that, as an example, Appendix 1 listing at CITES, highest level of international protection, brings the world into line with India, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, and really helps to tighten up. It raises the awareness of the species on enforcement agencies' radar. If you get caught with it, the penalties and fines are higher, so it's a better deterrent, and it really reinforces and backs what the countries are trying to do, which is just protect their own native species. So, Indian star tortoise is a big one, otters is another, but for the other 20 or so species, it really could be a situation where spiders, lizards, tortoises, otters, the message goes out to the world that globally these are wild animals that belong in the wild and they're not exotic pets. So we've just had some really great breaking news. Many of the species that we're really hoping would get increased protection here at CITES, both of the otter species, the Indian star tortoise, a whole raft of different lizards coming from Sri Lanka, and ornamental spiders have all got uplisted, in many cases to Appendix 1, the highest level of protection possible, and in other cases Appendix 2, which again just gives that extra increased protection. So at the moment we really couldn't be happier that the parties or the countries here have really listened to the evidence and have taken these extra steps.